Hi, so I'm Harriet Pattison. I'm from Liverpool Hope University, and I'm going to talk about a case study of self-directed education, which is a research project which we have just started. So for this presentation, I'll talk a little bit, first of all, about self-directed education and what we mean by self-directed education, and also a little bit about democratic schooling, because those are two things that in our case study are very much intertwined with each other. And then I want to explore some of the ideas that come up through that, through Biester's domains of education. So start off thinking about self-directed education. And the main area in which I've come across self-directed education is in home education, where a lot of parents pursue a philosophy, a pedagogy of child-centered education, with the child taking the lead in what they want to do, what interests they want to pursue. Alternative schools have also made use of self-directed pedagogy. I'm thinking of places like Sand School in Devon, Sudbury Valley Schools, and the educational centre where we're conducting this research is based on the Sudbury School model, and also probably most famously for the UK at Summerhill School in Suffolk. So self-directed education has been picked up in recent years also by innovations in higher education, where there's been a move towards more learner-directed forms of pedagogy, thinking particularly of things like problem-based learning, where the onus has been put more on students to direct their own research projects, and staff have been seen more as procedural guides and facilitators, but students expected to direct the course of their own learning. And that idea of self-direction fits in really nicely with current thinking about children and constructions of childhood, where since the inception of UNCRC, there's been a lot more emphasis on the agentic child, and children being seen as rightfully and morally as well party to making decisions about their own lives and the direction of their own lives, and having a say in important decisions. And obviously for most children, education takes up a very great proportion of their life and is a very important area in which to have a say about what they do. So in terms of the educational setting in which we're conducting the research, it's not a school, it's an educational setting because it doesn't offer full-time education, but it is working towards becoming a school. And in order for that to happen, Ofsted have to carry out an inspection. So if there's anybody listening who's got experience of working with Ofsted and thinking about the kind of questions that self-directed education raises for Ofsted, then it would be really interesting to carry that discussion on into the webinar. But the main principle within the setting is of self-motivation, self-initiation, and ultimately self-direction of education, with the thinking behind that when children are doing something, students are doing something because they want to do it, and because they're interested in it, and because they have set their own particular goals or have their own particular visions about what it is that they're undertaking, then that learning becomes much more engaged, much more effective, much deeper, much more satisfying than if those goals are something which are imposed from the outside. And underlying some of those arguments about the efficacy of self-directed education is the idea that actually this is quite natural. This is how children begin to learn when they're very small. Children are very effective in the early years at learning all sorts of things, walking, talking, hosts of other things as well. And they are able to do that because they have a repertoire of naturally occurring behaviours, things like curiosity, play, imitation, a drive to be sociable, all of which make that early learning very effective, and that pursuing that further into self-directed education is just a continuation of what comes naturally in the early years, and its effectiveness can carry on in just the same way as children get older. Sorry, that's a slide with a quote from two pupils who graduated from self-directed education, talking about how they think about goal setting and achievements. So I'll just leave that for you to read. So onto democracy, which, as I said earlier, is a principle that's become very much intertwined with self-directed education. And democracy has become increasingly important as a principle in mainstream schooling as well in recent years, particularly since the inception of fundamental British values, in which schools are required to show that democratic practice is embedded into school life. And very often that's enacted in things like having a school council that can represent students on particular issues, or pupils perhaps taking a vote on certain things, providing some feedback. With self-directed education, though, that idea of democracy is really taken to another level, much more, I think, in terms of Abraham Lincoln's idea of government of the people, by the people, for the people. And the idea is that students, as everybody else in the school, are involved in every single decision that has to be made in the running of the school and in the enactment of their education. And the idea behind that, apart from promoting the democratic environment, is that what this offers is a scaled down version of society. So students have, on the one hand, they have the freedom and the liberty that they need to pursue self-directed education, but at the same time, they are part of a community. They're part of an intentional community. And that community needs to operate for the benefit of everybody who's taking part in it. So there has to be a tension, a balance between the individual and the individual's pursuance of what they want to do, and the society, the community that they're doing it in, and the fairness of that community for everybody who's involved in it. So those two things, the self-directed education and the democratic thinking, are very much intertwined with each other. So this is a quote from my co-researcher, Kezia Cantwell-Wright, who is also principle of the democratic school, democratic setting that we're looking at, where she explains much better than I just have about that interconnection between democracy on the one hand and self-directed education on the other. So I wanted to take some of those ideas now, and as I say, have a look at them through the lens of Harriet Pattisson's domains of education. And his argument is that there are three domains, three spheres of influence pertaining to all manner of education, and that this isn't things that we pursue necessarily, but they are things which are embedded in education, whether we recognize them, whether we think about them, or whether we don't. So the first of those he calls qualification, and that's to do with the content of what's learnt, with the skills and the knowledge that students are acquiring through that education. And in the diagram, I've made that circle the biggest because, as Beester says, this is where most of the emphasis comes in mainstream schooling. Most of the emphasis is put on the content of what it is that students are learning and what skills it is that they are acquiring. But at the same time, he argues important education is taking place in terms of socialization as well. And socialization he defines as being the way that education positions students within society, the way that they learn who they are as a group, group understandings, the making and sharing of meanings, and understanding their place within the group. And alongside that, he talks about subjectification as being the third domain of education. And this is the area in which students become the people that they are, become the kind of person that they are. And we can see that that individuality is something that may stand in contrast to whatever it is that they learn through qualification and even through socialization, because it's talking about the inherent traits of people. And it might be, for instance, perfectly possible for somebody to know a lot about the content of democracy and understand the principles of democracy, but still decide not to employ them in their own life or in some project that they are running or some group that they are involved in. So he sees these as being three separate but interlinked notions about education. So when we take those arguments and we look at how they apply in the self-directed education centre, the emphasis is very different. So in terms of qualification, this is seen in self-directed education, this is seen as being the least important of those, represented by the smallest circle, whereas socialisation and subjectification are seen as being much more important, lying much more at the heart of education. And the reason for this, as explained by Kezia, and as the principles that are used to guide and to run the self-directed education centre, is the idea that qualification is actually the easiest part of that triumvirate to address. As she argues, skills and knowledge are not that difficult to acquire. If we want to know something or we want to get better at something, there are all sorts of things that we can do in order to do that, to become better or to acquire new knowledge about something. On the other hand, she says, socialization is what's really difficult to master, that skill of getting on with other people, or that skill of being able to balance your own interests, your own self-direction within the needs of a community, perhaps having to live with restrictions or rules that are difficult and perhaps not what an individual would choose, but which need to be in place for the good of the community. And reaching that level of understanding and finding that balance, she argues, is what's difficult and what education needs to concentrate on. And it also needs to concentrate on Biester's zone of subjectification, about becoming, developing as a person into ways in which are going to enable that socialization. So things like owning your own responsibility, accepting your own mistakes, being motivated, finding your own self-motivation, knowing what it is that you want to do, being able to persevere with the things that you want to do. So those kinds of strong character traits. And once those two things are in place, the socialization and the subjectification, then the qualification falls into place behind those, becomes perhaps the last, but certainly the easiest part of those things to acquire. And so education really needs to focus on socialization and subjectification, and that's the guiding principle of the Self-Directed Education Centre. So thank you very much for listening to that, and hope that we are able to discuss some of these ideas in the webinar later on. Thank you.